Hello viewers, welcome. Today we will study impact of Renaissance on Elizabethan literature. So let's get started. It is difficult to date or define the Renaissance. Etymologically, the term which was first used in England only as the 18th century means rebirth. Broadly speaking, the Renaissance implies that reawakening of learning which came to Europe in 14th and 15th century. The Renaissance was not only an English but an European phenomenon and basically considered it signalized a thorough substitution of the medieval habit of thought by new attitude. The dawn of the Renaissance came first to Italy and a little later to France. To England it came much later, roughly about the beginning of 16th century. As we have said at the outset, it is It is difficult to date the Renaissance. However, it may be mentioned that in Italy the impact of Greek learning was first felt when, after the Turkish conquest of Constantinople, the Greek scholars fled and took refuge in Italy, carrying with them a vast treasure of ancient Greek literature in manuscript. The study of this literature fired the soul and imagination of the Italy of that time and created a new kind of intellectual and aesthetic culture, quite different from that of Middle Ages. The light of the Renaissance came very slowly to the isolated island of England, so that when it did come in all its brilliance in 16th century, the Renaissance in Italy had already become a spent force. So it was on decline. It is difficult to define the Renaissance, but in broad implication in England do not defy discussion. The effect of Renaissance on English literature were an increased emphasis on humanism, individualism, of, as well as an increased willingness of writer to satirize existing institutions such as the church and the state and to write secular rather than religious works. Poetry from the Italian Renaissance, such as Sonnet of the Petrarch, one of the first humanists, influenced the poetry of Sir Thomas Wyatt, the Earl of Surrey, and Sir Philip Sidney, among others. Wyatt introduced the sonnet into English, and the Earl of Surrey was the first to write in blank verse in English. Sidney and other poets wrote about their experiences of love in a way that was individualized and secular, two hallmark of the Renaissance. So, more correctly, we can say that the following are the implications of Renaissance in England. First, the Renaissance meant the death of medieval scholasticism, which had for long been keeping human thought in bondage, in shackles. The schoolmen got themselves entangled in useless controversies and tried to apply the principles of Aristotelian philosophy to the doctrines of Christianity, thus giving birth to a vast literature characterized by polemics, casuistry, and sophistry, which did not advance man in any way. Secondly, it signalized a revolt against spiritual authority, the authority of the Pope. The Reformation, though not a part of the revival of learning, was yet a companion movement in England. So, a Reformation movement came along with Renaissance, and this play a very important role in flowering of literature and art in England. This defiance of spiritual authority went hand in hand with that of intellectual authority. So, this reformation went hand in hand with intellectual pursuit. Renaissance intellectuals distinguished themselves by their flagrant anti authoritarianism. Thirdly, the Renaissance implied a greater perception of beauty and polish in Greek and Latin scholars. This beauty and this polish were sought by Renaissance men of letters to be incorporated in their native literature. Further, it meant the birth of kind of imitative tendency implied in term classicism. Lastly, the Renaissance marked a change from the theocentric to the homocentric conception of universe. Human life, pursuit, and even the body came to be glorified. Human life, as H.G. Meyer observed, which the medieval church has taught them, the people to regard but as a threshold and a stepping stone to eternity, acquired suddenly a new momentousness and value. So value of humanism increased. The other worldliness gave place to this worldliness. Human values came to be recognized as a permanent values, and then they were sought to be enriched and illumined by the heritage of antiquity, by the old people. This breed a new kind of paganism and marked the rise of humanism, is also by the implication and materialism. Let us now consider the impact of Renaissance on the various departments of English literature. So it has effect in English literature. We will um, we will evaluate it one by one. The Renaissance, inspired by classical drama, by the Greek and Romans, brought innovations to English drama, which was formerly formerly mainly concentrated on mystery plays that were religious in nature. During the Renaissance, drama became secularized. Shakespeare's plays written during the English Renaissance are commentaries on the human condition and reflection on the Renaissance emphasis of humanism. For example, Hamlets include the theme of the father-son relationship, of guilt, of woman's relationship to men, of mother-son relationship, of madness, and many other themes that define us as humans and that we still wrestle with. Other works during the English Renaissance, such as More's Utopia, Thomas More's Utopia, were discourses on the components of the ideal society and offered criticism of the current state of England. Writers during this time period were willing to criticize the church and state in search of greater happiness for individual with the society. So, new creative literature. Naturally enough, the first impact of the Renaissance in England was registered by the universities being the repository of all learning. Some English scholars becoming aware of the revival of learning in Italy went to that country to benefit by it and to examine personally the manuscript brought there by fleeing Greek scholars of Constantinople. Prominent among these scholars were William Grocyn, Thomas Linacre, and John Colet. After after returning from Italy, they organized the teaching of Greek in Oxford. They were such learned and reputed scholars of Greek that Erasmus came all the way from Holland to learn Greek from them. Apart from scholars, the impact of the Renaissance is also, in a measure, to be seen on the work of the educationists of the age. Sir Thomas Eliot wrote The Governor, which is treatise on moral philosophy modeled on Italian works and full of the spirit of Roman antiquity. Other educationists were Sir John Cheke, Sir Thomas Wilson, and Sir Roger Ascham. Out of all the educationists, the last named is the most important on account of the schoolmaster, published 2 years after his death. So Roger Hashem published Schoolmaster. Therein, he puts forward his view on teaching of classics. His own style in is too obviously based upon the ancient Roman writers. By turn, remarks Ligois, he imitates Cicero periods and the Seneca's nervous consciousness. In addition to these well known educationists, must be mentioned the sizable number of now obscure one, those who unacknowledged unknown guides who is school and university were teaching men to admire and imitate the masterpiece of the antiquity. Legois says Legois. So this was new creative literature during the Renaissance period. Now we will move on. The most important prose writer who exhibit well the influence of the Renaissance on English prose are Erasmus, Sir Thomas More, Lilly, and Sidney. The first named was Dutchman, who, as we have already said, came to Oxford to learn Greek. So Erasmus was Greek scholar. Erasmus was Dutch scholar who came to Oxford to learn Greek. His chief work was The Praise of Folly. Erasmus' Praise of Folly, which is the English translation of his most important work written in England. It is, according to Tucker book, the best expression in literature of the attack that the Oxford reformers were making upon medieval system. Erasmus wrote this work in 1510 at the house of his friend Sir Thomas More, who was executed at bidding of Henry VIII for his refusal to give up his allegiance to the Pope. Moat Thomas More's famous prose romance Utopia was, in words of Legois, true prologue to the Renaissance. It was first book written by an Englishman which achieved European fame, but it was written in Latin. It was written in 1516 and only later at 1555 was translated into English. Curiously enough, the next work by Englishman again to acquire European fame was Bacon's Novum Organum, and it was also written originally in Latin. The word utopia is from Greek utopus, which means utopus, meaning no place. Moore's utopia is an imaginary island which is the habitat of an ideal republic. By the picture of the ideal state is implied a kind of social criticism of contemporary England. Moore's indebtedness to Plato's Republic is quite obvious. So, Moore's Utopia was quite inspired by Plato's Republic. Moreover, Moore seems also to be indebted to then recent discoveries of the explorers and navigators like Columbus and Vasco da Gama, who were mostly of Spanish and Portuguese nationalities. In Utopia, Moore discredits medievalism in all its implication and exalt the ancient Greek culture. So it was such a famous work, and we will go to the next famous work. And Legois observed about his this work. Utopians are the Utopians are in revolt against the spirit of chivalry. They hate warfare and despise soldiers. Communism is the law of land, and all are workers for only a limited number of hours. Life should be pleasant for all. Asceticism is condemned. more relies on goodness of human nature and intones a hymn or glory of the senses. So, which reveals nature's wonders. In utopia, all religions are authorized and tolerance is the law. Socialist is scaffold. Then Moore's Utopia created a new genre in which can be classed such works as a Bacon's The New Atlantis, Samuel's Butler Home, W. H. Mallock's The New Republic, Richard Jefferies' After London, W. H. Hudson The Crystal Age, William Morris News from Nowhere, H. G. Wells A Modern Utopia. So these were inspired by Utopia by Thomas More. Now, passing on to the prose writers of the Elizabethan age, the age of following of the Renaissance, we find them markedly influenced both in their style and thought content by revival of the unique classical learning. Sydney in Arcadia, Lilly in Euphus, and Hooker in the laws of ecclesiastical polity, write in English which is away from the language of common speech and is either too heavily laden, as in the case of Sydney and Lilly, and a bit of classical finery, modelled on Latin syntax, as in the case of Hooker. So this was the case, and Cicero seemed to these writers a very obvious and respectable model. Bacon, however, in his sententiousness and coggency, comes near Tacitus and turns away from the prolixity, diffusiveness, and ornamentation associated with Ciceronian prose. Further, in his own career and his essay, Bacon stands as a representative of the materialistic Machiavellian facets of Renaissance, particularly of Renaissance Italy. He combines in himself the dispassionate pursuit of truth and the keen desire for material advance. So it was the effect of effect Renaissance on poetry, on the prose of Elizabethan time. Now we will move forward for the poetry. Sir Thomas Wyatt and the Earl of Surrey were pioneers of new poetry in England. After Chaucer, the spirit of English poetry had slumbered for upward of a century. The change in pronunciation in the 15th century had created a lot of confusion in prosody, which in the practice of such important poets as Lydgate and Skelton had been reduced to mockery. The revival, as Lewis says, was an uphill task. As Mads put it, it is with these two countries that the modern English poetry begins. Though they wrote much earlier, it was only in 1557, a year before Elizabeth's coronation, that their work was published in Total Smithsonian, which, according to H. G. Mads, one of the landmarks of English literature. Of two, Wyatt has travelled extensively in Italy and France and had come under the spell of Italian Renaissance. It must be remembered that the work of Wyatt and Surrey does not reflect the impact of the Rome of antiquity alone, but also that of the modern Italy. So far as versification is concerned, Wyatt and Surrey imported into England various new Italian metrical patterns. It goes to the credit of Wyatt to have introduced the sonnet into English literature and the Surrey to have first written blank verse. Both the sonnets and blank verse were later to be practiced by vast number of the best English poets. So it was like that. Wyatt and Surrey were pioneers in the field of poetry. Now Effect of Renaissance drama. The revival of ancient classical learning scored its first clear impact on English drama in the middle of the 16th century. Previous to this impact, there had been a pretty vigorous native traditions of drama, particularly comedy. This tradition had its origin in liturgical drama and had progressed through the miracles and the mystery and the latter the morality to the interlude. John Haywood had written quite a few vigorous interludes, but they were altogether different in tone, spirit, and purpose from the Greek and Roman dramas of antiquity. The first English regular tragedy, Gorboduc, written by Sackville and Norton and first acted in 1562, and the comedy Ralph Roister Doister, written about in 1550 by Nicholas Udall, were very much imitations of classical tragedy and comedy. It is interesting to note that English dramatists came not under the spell of ancient Greek dramatists and but the Roman dramatists, they came under the influence of Roman dramatists like Seneca, the tragedy writer, Plautus, Terence, and comedy writers. It was indeed unfortunate as Greek drama is vastly superior to Roman drama. Gorboduc is a slavish imitation of Senecan tragedy. Now, later on, University wits struck a note of independence in this in their dramatic work. They refused to copy Roman dramas as slavishly as writers of Gorboduc and Rolf Reister Doister. Even so, their plays are not free from impact of Renaissance. Rather, they show it is a imply through not in the same way. In their imagination, they were all fired by the new literature, which showed them new dimensions of human capabilities. They were humanist um, through and through. All of them, Lily, Green, Peel, Nash, Lodge, Marlowe and Kidd, show in their dramatic work art, of course, a slavish tendency to ape the ancient. So, university wits were inspired by ancient writers, but a chemical reaction of the Renaissance learning on the native genius fired by the enthusiasm of discovery and aspirations so typical of the Elizabethan age. In this respect, Marlowe stands in forefront of university wits. Rightly has he has been called the true child of Renaissance. So it was all effect of Renaissance on literature of Elizabethan age. Thank you so much for listening to me.